Vladimir Putin, explaining to the world how he won against NATO. This was happening right outside his window. October 2nd, 2025. Sochi, Russia's jewel on the Black Sea, Putin's personal stronghold. The Valdai Discussion Club, the Kremlin's most prestigious propaganda platform for sending messages of power and control to the world. For 4 hours, Vladimir Putin told a select audience and the entire world how Russia was fighting almost the entire NATO bloc, and yet still making steady progress and unshakable self-confidence.
Они же не могут верить в то, что говорят, что Россия собирается нападать на НАТО.
But just minutes after he finished speaking, explosions began to echo in the skies above the same city, drowning out the lights of the propaganda stage. Ukrainian drones were striking Putin's stronghold while his words were still hanging in the air. This was the moment when Putin's personal security bubble was punctured, not by a pin, but by an explosive, in full view of the world. Sochi airports were locked down for 7 hours, panic broke out in the city, and the Kremlin leader was humiliated in his own home, as if mocking his own words. This was not just a military attack. It was a perfectly timed psychological assassination attempt aimed directly at Putin. This was the "emperor has no clothes" moment. And from that moment on, the rules of war would never be the same again. To understand the layers and strategic genius of this historic humiliation, we must examine the two different realities of that night, its two separate acts. The fantasy world Putin created and the brutal reality Ukraine brought crashing down upon it. The Valdai Forum is not just another conference for the Kremlin. It is an annual ritual where Putin markets his vision of an alternative world order to the West, flexes his muscles to his allies, and reinforces his image as a world leader to the domestic audience. The choice of Sochi is no coincidence. The city has become synonymous with Putin's personal brand, the glamour of the Winter Olympics, the luxury of the Black Sea, and most importantly, an impenetrable security fortress housing his official residence, Bochorov Ruchi. Valdai is a theater stage controlled by Putin, where every detail is meticulously scripted. On this stage, every question is predetermined, every answer is memorized, and every applause is guaranteed. And on the night of October 2nd, Putin was the star of this stage. His speech and Q&A session, lasting nearly 4 hours, resembled a victory speech. He accused the West of hypocrisy, praised Russia's economic resilience, and most importantly, boasted about its military power. He had just finished a speech and Q&A session that lasted nearly 4 hours. His demeanor was defiant, mocking, and projected an image of absolute control. He dismissed Western concerns that Russia could attack a NATO country as nonsense, and responded mockingly to US President Donald Trump's description of Russia as a paper tiger by telling NATO to go and deal with this paper tiger. This moment was the brightest brick in the massive wall of illusion that Kremlin propaganda had been building for years, depicting Russia's unshakable power and the untouchable status of its leader. At the peak of his speech, he uttered those unforgettable words: "I have said that for years Russia has been fighting not with the Ukrainian armed forces, not with Ukraine, but with almost all NATO countries. If we are fighting the entire NATO bloc and making steady progress, then what is NATO itself? What does it represent?" This was not just a propaganda phrase, it was a challenge. It was a claim that Russia alone could challenge and defeat the entire West. At 10 p.m., as Putin finished his speech and accepted applause, this image of a strong and in control leader seemed flawless. But this image lasted only minutes. Around 10:30 p.m. Moscow time, the airports in Sochi and the neighboring resort town of Gelendzhik were suddenly closed to all flights. A few minutes later, sirens began blaring in the city's skies. Videos uploaded to local Telegram channels showed air defense systems firing over the Black Sea, explosions lighting up the night, and the sound of drone engines whirring in the sky. The significance of the location where this unfolded was immense. Sochi is not just any resort town, it is one of Putin's primary residences and one of his most heavily fortified bunkers. Panic spread. Dmitry Plishkin, head of the Sirius Federal District, issued a pleading message to the public. "All forces and resources are ready to repel this. Please remain calm, stay away from windows, and take shelter in a safe place." This was the exact opposite of the "everything is under control" message. It was an admission. The castle walls had been breached. This was not Ukraine's first attack on Putin's personal space. Just a month earlier, on September 9th, another drone attack had been launched near Putin's residence in Bocharov-Ruche. But this time was different. This was not just a warning shot, but a declaration. Ukraine had escalated its message from "we are watching you" to "we can strike you whenever we want, wherever we want, even when you are most proud." The timing was perfect. Putin had defied the world for 4 hours. Ukraine responded within 10 minutes. But another frightening aspect of this story was that Sochi was just the tip of the iceberg. That night, one of the largest and most coordinated drone attacks in history was taking place over Russia's vast territory. The Russian Defense Ministry was later forced to announce that a total of 85 UAVs had been shot down that same night over the Voronezh, Saratov, Belgorod, Rostov, Volgograd, and Penza regions, as well as over annexed Crimea. This was not a regional attack, but a full-scale strategic bombardment. This was proof of how Russia's much-vaunted layered air defense network was helpless against a swarm of drones, systematically collapsing. The chain reaction created by this wave of attacks spreading across Sochi and Russia as a whole was much deeper and more lasting than the physical damage caused by the missiles. It was the collapse of an illusion. Just a few UAVs were enough to paralyze one of Russia's most important tourism, diplomacy, and logistics centers for hours. According to official data, the Sochi and Gelendzhik airports were shut down for a full 7 hours. This led to chaos that continued until Friday morning. The Federal Air Transport Agency reported that 10 planes bound for Sochi were diverted to other cities. Among these other cities was even Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, hundreds of kilometers away. The Association of Russian Tour Operators, ATOR, announced that as of Friday morning, more than 40 flights were delayed at Sochi airport, including 24 departures and about 20 arrivals. This meant not only that thousands of passengers were stranded, but also that Russia's southern capital was completely locked down. Putin's international guests, after watching his show of force, had to wait 7 hours to return home. Because that night, the sky belonged to Ukraine. Sochi is not just a resort town, it is a multi-billion-dollar economic engine. Tourism, real estate, and international events are the lifeblood of the city. This attack destroyed the city's image as a safe haven. No international investor, no tourist, not even wealthy Russians will trust a city where they know they are not safe, even next to Putin's own palace. This was a direct blow to the city's economy and Putin's personal prestige. Ukraine's attack on Sochi was not a simple military action. Although the military damage of these attacks is usually minimal, their psychological impact is enormous. This is much deeper than an attack carried out with missiles or tanks. This is one of the greatest psychological assassination attempts in history, targeting a leader's soul, image, and legitimacy. Ukraine is not only fighting on the front lines, it is also systematically dismantling the myth of the invincible leader, stable country, and impregnable fortress that Putin has spent more than 2 decades building. Ukraine's goal was clear: to erase Putin's myth, his psychological identity. Vladimir Putin's greatest power was not nuclear missiles or FSB agents, but the myth of invincibility, stability, and control that he had meticulously built for over 20 years. Now Ukraine has launched an all-out war against this myth. The weapons of this war are kamikaze drones setting Russian oil refineries ablaze, kilometer-long queues at gas stations, and the sound of explosions in the skies above Putin's most secure palaces. Putin's tacit social contract with the Russian people was simple: stay out of politics, and I will bring you order, stability, and economic prosperity after the chaos of the 90s. The war in Ukraine was slowly eroding each clause of this contract. But Ukraine's strategic refinery attacks in recent months have turned this erosion into a complete collapse. Ukraine's long-range drones are now targeting not only military objectives, but also the economic heart of Russia, its oil refineries. Tuapse, Ryazan, Nizhny Novgorod, Samara. These massive facilities, located hundreds, even thousands of kilometers inland, were struck one after another with surgical precision. These attacks disabled at least 15% of Russia's petroleum product production capacity. This was not just a statistical figure, it was the beginning of an economic earthquake felt across Russia. The first result was a nationwide fuel crisis. Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, became unable to provide gasoline and diesel to its own citizens. Kilometers-long queues at gas stations suddenly became part of daily life. Prices skyrocketed. In agricultural regions like Krasnodar, governors raised the banner of rebellion against the Kremlin because farmers couldn't find diesel to harvest their crops. In some parts of Siberia, even emergency vehicles began to receive fuel ration cards. This scene starkly revealed how hollow Putin's promise of stability was, hitting the average Russian citizen in the face in the most painful way. The war was no longer just a news story on television. It was an empty gas tank in the car. This fuel crisis is only the most visible symptom of a larger economic crisis. The war has turned into a black hole that is devouring all of the country's resources. Skilled labor and capital have been stolen from civilian sectors for the production of tanks and missiles. As a result, we are witnessing the collapse of giants like Avtovaz, mass resignations, and the slow death of industrial cities known as mono-cities. Rising inflation, empty shelves, and now fuel shortages. Putin's 20-year illusion of prosperity has been crushed and destroyed under the brutal reality of war. This was the first and most effective step in the psychological assassination, striking directly at the people's pockets and stomachs. The second pillar of Putin's legitimacy was the promise of national pride and security. He was the leader who rebuilt Russia, made its borders impenetrable, and challenged the West. The propaganda machine had been pumping out the image of Fortress Russia for years, touting the invincibility of air defense systems such as the S-400. Ukraine's deep strikes shattered this myth as well. The success of the refinery attacks was not only an economic blow, but also an admission that Russian air defense was a complete failure. The fact that slow-moving drones, relatively easy to detect, could repeatedly strike Russia's most strategic facilities hundreds of kilometers deep, revealed that the Kremlin's billion-dollar air defense shield was actually a paper tiger. This created deep insecurity in the minds of the Russian people. If the state couldn't protect the country's most important economic assets, how could it protect an ordinary city or a home? This psychological impact deepened as the war became Russia's internal affair. In the first year of the war, the fighting was mostly on Ukrainian soil, and life continued as normal for the average Muscovite. But now, from Belgorod to Kursk, from Bryansk to Rostov, the sound of sirens, explosions, and images of burning facilities have become part of daily life. The war was no longer a special military operation, but a tangible threat that could knock on the door at any moment. This also meant the failure of Putin's promise of a safe homeland. Every hole opened in the impregnable castle walls chipped away at Putin's image. The most daring and personal stage of the psychological assassination, however, is the attacks that directly target Putin himself and his image of invulnerability. Putin has always positioned himself as a modern Tsar, living in ultra-luxurious, high-security palaces in Valdai or Sochi, far removed from the problems of ordinary people. He was above everything, untouchable, and always in control. However, the latest attack was a masterfully timed psychological warfare operation that undermined Putin's invincible Russia, standing up to all of NATO doctrine, which he had just proclaimed at the Valdai Forum, at the very moment and place he had announced it. Putin's doctrine, Moscow time 2200. We are fighting almost the entire NATO bloc and are making steady progress. So what is NATO itself? Reality, Moscow time 2230. The airport in Putin's city is being closed, sirens are blaring, and air defense systems are desperately firing to protect their own president. This brutal contrast was instant proof of how hollow Putin's words were. Ukraine had struck not just a target, but a narrative. The Kremlin's power propaganda was shattered by the real explosions in the skies over Sochi. Putin was challenging NATO. Ukraine reminded him that the real problem was not NATO, but himself. This time, the target was not a radar or command center, but directly the head of the Russian state and his most important propaganda platform. The Valdai speech is the Kremlin's annual framework text for the outside world. Right at this moment, an attack on the host city sends a clear message to international observers, potential allies, and even partners like China. This man you are listening to cannot even protect his own front yard. This is a move that undermines Putin's global image and makes him look diplomatically weak and untrustworthy. It was a move that trapped him on his own stage. This attack now leaves Putin with an impossible dilemma. How will he respond to this personal humiliation? Will he launch even more brutal attacks on Ukraine? This would only strengthen Ukraine's resolve. Or will he remain silent? This would be an admission of weakness and empower his rivals within the Kremlin. Ukraine has forced Putin into a strategic checkmate. By attacking Sochi, which Putin sees as his safe haven, while he was speaking, Ukraine has burst his security bubble and shown how vulnerable he is, even in the place that should be most protected. This rupture occurred precisely in a location synonymous with the Putin brand, Sochi. Ultimately, the explosions echoing across the skies of Sochi on the night of October 2, 2025, were not merely the sound of a military attack. They were the declaration that an emperor had no clothes, that a castle's walls were made of sand, and that a propaganda machine had failed. This wave of Ukrainian attacks represents a new normal in the war. Russia's vast territory is no longer a defensive advantage, but a security nightmare where every point is vulnerable. The collapse of the home front is no longer just an economic or social phenomenon, but also a physical reality. By repeatedly and successfully attacking Putin's personal spaces and high-profile events, Ukraine aims to destabilize the regime at its very top and nullify its legitimacy both in the eyes of its own people and the global elite. If even a leader's personal safety is not guaranteed, how safe is an ordinary Russian citizen? This question is now being whispered in every corner of Russia. The war is no longer just at the front. The war is now everywhere in Russia. And most importantly, the war is now at Putin's doorstep. When all these vectors converge, they create a spiral of fear, suspicion, insecurity, and anger within Russian society. Putin is falling into the position of a leader who cannot deliver on all the fundamental promises he made to his people. A military defeat can be slow and bloody, but the collapse of a leader's legend is much faster and more destructive. So what do you think? Will Ukraine's psychological warfare strategy be enough to break the Russian people's support for the war? Could Putin, whose image has been shaken, resort to even more reckless and dangerous moves? Share your valuable opinions and analyses with us in the comments section. Thank you for choosing us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to support our independent analyses.